The first time Nora Mason saw the oak, she thought it looked like something that had decided a long time ago to outlive everyone around it. Its trunk rose from the earth like a pillar of history, wrapped in slow, deliberate scars that mapped decades of storms, droughts, and quiet resilience. She hadn't chosen the house because of the oak. It was simply part of the property, an old element folded into the neighborhood's design. But over time, it became the only thing that grounded her. Working as a lighting designer meant her life revolved around artificial glow, stage simulations, and perfect symmetry. The oak reminded her that shadows, too, were natural, that darkness had its own right to exist. Her house sat in a small, older community at the edge of a redeveloped district, where everything new came polished, symmetrical, and unnaturally bright. She was one of the few who didn't repaint her mailbox or trim her hedges to match the new minimalist standard. The others tolerated her, barely, because she paid her dues, kept her yard tidy, and never made noise. Then Joel Braxton moved in. His arrival didn't come quietly. There were trucks, landscapers, and a team of uniformed contractors unloading something that gleamed under the midday sun. Within 2 weeks, his lot had transformed into what looked like a luxury clinic. Open decks with mirrored glass, terraces lined with reflective panels that caught and scattered light across the neighborhood. He called it his phototherapeutic retreat, and though no one quite understood what that meant, the neighbors smiled, impressed by the phrase's sleekness. Joel introduced himself with a rehearsed smile, the kind that felt like a brand logo rather than a greeting. He spoke of energy harmonics, biological symmetry, and the tyranny of shade. When he finally noticed Nora's oak, his smile dimmed. "That thing must be ancient," he said. "You ever think of removing it? It's blocking the entire spectrum from the west." Nora thought he was joking. She laughed lightly, said something about it keeping the place cool in the afternoons. But his eyes, pale and analytical, didn't shift from the branches. "It's a light sponge," he said after a moment, almost to himself. "No wonder your house feels heavy." She didn't answer. She didn't see a need to. For weeks after, she noticed him measuring angles with a device that resembled a small periscope. Sometimes, when she returned home from work, faint chalk marks lined the sidewalk in front of her fence, neat and geometric. The oak's shadow stretched across them like defiance. Then came the letter, neatly folded, stamped with the county's seal, notifying her of a complaint regarding environmental light obstruction allegedly caused by her property. The phrasing was almost comical, so bureaucratic it felt fictional. Yet it carried legal weight, and the closing line chilled her. Failure to address the issue could result in administrative penalties or forced correction. She stood beneath the oak that evening, tracing her fingers along the bark's cool grooves, listening to the faint hum of cicadas. The neighborhood shimmered under Joel's mirrored panels, light bouncing from surface to surface until it felt clinical, hollow. Her yard, by contrast, breathed in shadow and silence. She hadn't realized until then how fragile peace could be, how easily a single person's obsession could turn sunlight into a weapon. The complaint didn't seem urgent at first. Nora assumed it was a clerical mistake, a mix-up of property codes or an exaggerated neighborhood concern that would dissolve once someone from the county actually visited and saw how harmless everything was. But when the second letter arrived, this time bearing a notice of formal review, she realized that what had begun as a neighbor's annoyance was evolving into something far more deliberate. The county's Environmental Compliance Office informed her that an inspection was scheduled in 10 days, citing potential violations related to light balance disruption and unsanctioned vegetation encroachment. She had never seen either term used before, and the language struck her as suspiciously crafted to sound technical without meaning much of anything. The letter even referenced a community advocate who had submitted multiple photographic reports documenting the oak's shadow at various hours. There was no signature, but she knew who it was. From that moment on, Joel's presence became impossible to ignore. Every morning, just as the first slant of sunlight reached the street, he would appear outside with a clipboard and a sleek silver device that projected beams of light across the ground. He moved with quiet precision, mapping angles, recording data, occasionally crouching to make notes. It was not the behavior of a man complaining about a tree. It was the behavior of someone preparing for litigation. The few neighbors who walked their dogs would pause, glance at him, and continue quickly, unwilling to engage. Nora caught fragments of his conversations, softly spoken words about health interference, psychological dimming, and spatial imbalance. The absurdity of it all should have been funny, but it wasn't. There was something methodical in the way he approached his campaign, as though he were orchestrating not just an argument, but an environment in which he could not possibly be wrong. When the inspector finally arrived, Nora tried to appear calm. The woman, wearing a county badge and a polite but detached smile, carried a tablet that flickered with aerial maps. She was courteous, even apologetic, explaining that her visit was procedural. Yet as she walked around the property, pointing the tablet toward the tree, Nora noticed how carefully she avoided meeting her eyes. It was as if she already understood this inspection had nothing to do with safety or legality, and everything to do with appeasing someone influential. The woman measured the distance between the oak's canopy and the property line, noted the shadow's reach, and asked a series of oddly specific questions. Had Nora installed any artificial shading devices? Was she aware that reflective structures nearby were part of a registered wellness enterprise? Had she granted consent for overlapping light zones? Nora could barely keep up with the terminology. Light zones, she repeated. The inspector gave a rehearsed shrug. It's new language, part of the county's experimental energy management ordinance. She didn't elaborate. 2 days later, another document arrived, an interim notice advising her to take corrective action. The phrase echoed ominously through her mind as she reread the letter under the muted glow of her desk lamp. The oak stood outside her window, its branches moving slowly in the night wind, indifferent to bureaucratic threats. But she felt the unease of someone who understood that logic no longer applied. Joel had found a way to weaponize administrative language, and now the county itself was echoing his vocabulary. She called the office listed on the letter, hoping to reach someone human. After a half hour of hold music and redirections, a clerk admitted off record that the complaint had been unusually persistent, supported by private research from a local business. The business, she hinted, had sponsored several environmental programs in exchange for expedited hearings. When Nora asked for the name, the line went silent for a long moment before the clerk said quietly, "Braxton Light Wellness Initiative," and then ended the call. That night, Joel's property glowed like a stage set. The mirrored panels pulsed with faint amber light, timed to change hue every hour. The effect was eerie, an artificial sunset on repeat. At certain angles, the reflection reached her bedroom wall, sliding across her ceiling in a slow, rhythmic shimmer. Sleep became impossible. She tried closing the curtains, but the light found cracks, seeping through like a reminder that boundaries meant nothing here. The next morning, she discovered a new sign at the end of the street, Community Light Restoration Project, Phase 1. Below it, in small print, the Braxton Initiative logo gleamed. Neighbors who once nodded politely began avoiding her. A woman who used to garden across the road now crossed the street whenever Nora stepped outside. 2 men from the Homeowners Association arrived one afternoon under the pretense of routine neighborhood assessment, but their questions were transparent. They asked whether she planned to cooperate with the new zoning proposal, whether she understood that resistance would complicate integration. When she refused to sign the form they handed her, one of them smiled thinly and said, "It's always better to align with progress." For the first time, Nora felt the shift not just in policy but in atmosphere. The neighborhood was no longer quiet. It was complicit. The oak, once just a tree, had become a line in the sand. The county's involvement gave Joel legitimacy, and his calm, almost spiritual rhetoric about harmony made her opposition look irrational. Even the language of the letters was changing. Phrases like biological interference, luminous imbalance, and psychological burden of obstruction began to appear, as if someone were rewriting environmental science from scratch to justify personal vendetta. One evening, unable to bear the flicker of orange light pulsing from Joel's property, Nora walked outside. The air was thick with humidity, the kind that carried every sound. Joel stood by his fence, phone in hand, recording the way the oak's branches swayed. When he noticed her, he smiled, but the expression didn't reach his eyes. "You know," he said softly, "you could still make this easy. Trees fall all the time. One storm, one gust, and no one would blame you." She stared at him, too stunned to answer, as his gaze drifted upward toward the canopy, then back to her face. "Light," he murmured, "wants to move freely." She turned away, walked back inside and locked the door, though she knew locks meant little in a war fought with bureaucracy and optics. The notice still lay open on her desk, its seal pressed into the paper like an official curse. For years, she had designed artificial light to shape emotion and perception on stage. Now she understood how terrifying that power could be when used without empathy. Outside, the oak creaked softly in the wind, as if remembering storms long past. The first hearing was held in a bland municipal building that smelled faintly of disinfectant and paper dust, its walls covered in framed photographs of local restoration projects. Streams lined with wildflowers, playgrounds bathed in sunlight, smiling volunteers planting trees. The irony wasn't lost on Nora as she sat in the waiting area, beneath a poster that read, "Preserve our natural balance." The oak's measurements, height and canopy radius, had been converted into data points on someone's digital screen, abstracted into lines and shapes that looked like they belonged in a weather report. Joel arrived 10 minutes late, flanked by two people who looked less like legal aides and more like consultants from a wellness startup. Crisp linen shirts, calm expressions, tablets in hand. He greeted everyone with quiet authority, addressing the county representatives by name as if they were old acquaintances. When his eyes found Nora, his smile widened with that same unshakable composure, the kind that suggested he'd already decided the outcome. When the meeting began, Joel spoke first, presenting a slideshow titled "Restorative Illumination, Reclaiming Environmental Harmony." The lights dimmed, and on the screen appeared overlapping color maps, graphs showing solar absorption, and diagrams with arrows radiating outward like an expanding sun. He narrated in that practiced, hypnotic tone that made pseudoscience sound plausible. He explained how the oak's shade created a localized darkness pocket, affecting the circadian stability of nearby properties. He referred to collective exposure ratios and psychological depletion curves, citing studies no one had heard of. Every time someone on the panel frowned, his assistants produced a new document to reinforce the illusion of authority. Nora listened, incredulous, her palms slick with sweat as she realized that most of the room wasn't laughing. They were listening seriously, nodding at words like energy mapping and environmental fatigue. When it was her turn to speak, she tried to stay composed. She described the oak's history, its ecological value, its deep roots that prevented erosion during heavy rains. She brought photos from before Joel's arrival, showing the neighborhood's natural balance, the quiet normalcy that had existed for decades. But the panel's questions veered elsewhere. One commissioner asked whether the tree reflected her personal attachment to darkness. Another wondered if she had ever considered alternative light optimization solutions. Their phrasing echoed Joel's vocabulary so precisely that she knew he'd already shaped the narrative long before she entered the room. By the end of the session, the panel proposed a temporary compliance measure, a euphemism for partial trimming. It was a compromise that felt like surrender. Joel smiled politely, thanked the committee for their open-mindedness, and offered to provide transition lamps to ease Nora's adaptation to the new light conditions, as though he were granting mercy rather than victory. She left the building feeling hollow, the heat outside pressing against her face as though the sunlight itself were mocking her. Over the following weeks, the trimming order became a neighborhood spectacle. A crew arrived one morning without warning, men in orange vests carrying chainsaws and paperwork stamped with the county's seal. They claimed it was only a preventive cut, a standard procedure to maintain compliance. Nora refused them entry until she verified the permit, but as she argued, she noticed Joel across the street filming quietly from his porch, expression unreadable. The crew chief, visibly uncomfortable, finally admitted that the order had been expedited by community request. She demanded to know who made the request, but he only shrugged and said, "It came through the Light Restoration Project, ma'am." That night, she sat by her window, the oak silhouette framed against the restless glow from Joel's property. One of its larger branches now bore a raw wound where the bark had been stripped cleanly away. She felt the violation like a bruise, intimate, unhealable. Every time the wind passed through the canopy, the missing limb made the tree sound different, its rustle thinner, uncertain. She found herself talking to it softly, half in apology, half in defiance. Word spread through the neighborhood that she was difficult, that she was holding back progress. Someone left a flyer in her mailbox advertising the Braxton Light Retreat's grand opening, complete with testimonials about improved sleep and enhanced solar connection. Her house, now visibly darker in comparison to the mirrored facades surrounding it, stood out like a blemish. At night, her windows reflected the strange amber pulses from Joel's property, and sometimes, faintly, she thought she could hear recorded voices from his backyard sessions, gentle, synchronized chanting about releasing resistance. Days blurred into each other, a cycle of letters, inspections, and polite threats. The Environmental Compliance Office sent her a follow-up evaluation notice warning of potential fines if the trimming didn't continue to the committee's recommended extent. The document cited neighboring light deprivation effects, a phrase that seemed invented for the occasion. When she confronted the county clerk, he sighed and admitted that several complaints had been filed simultaneously, all citing identical language. "It looks coordinated," he said quietly, lowering his voice. "But once multiple households sign, it counts as community pressure. We can't ignore it." That evening, while walking past the oak to retrieve her mail, Nora noticed something glinting at the base of the trunk. It was a small circular sensor no larger than a coin, half buried in the mulch. She picked it up, heart pounding, and found on its side a faint engraving, BLI Tech Division, Braxton Light Initiative. He was monitoring the shadow, monitoring her. The realization struck her not as fear, but as a kind of furious clarity. Joel hadn't just filed complaints. He was building a data case, fabricating an ecosystem of evidence. Every device, every report, every synchronized phrase was designed to redefine her reality until even truth would sound uncooperative. She held the sensor tightly, feeling its smooth, lifeless surface against her palm, and understood that the battle had already shifted from arguments to manipulation of perception. When the next county notice arrived, summoning her to a final compliance review, she didn't panic. She printed every photograph she had, every time-stamped message, every receipt proving that Joel's installations came after his first complaint. She wasn't just defending a tree anymore. She was fighting to keep reality from being rewritten in someone else's language. Outside, the oak loomed against the night sky, scarred but alive, its shadow still stretching defiantly across the border that Joel refused to acknowledge. The second hearing was different from the first, not in structure, but in atmosphere. The air inside the chamber felt heavier, the faces behind the long table less curious and more guarded, as if they had already decided how the discussion would end before Nora even walked in. She had spent the week preparing evidence, photographs, reports from independent arborists, and a carefully worded statement that avoided emotion. She knew that any sign of anger would be twisted into instability, that Joel had already framed her as a woman obsessed with darkness, a narrative that played conveniently into his rhetoric about light deprivation psychology. She arrived early, sitting quietly in the front row, listening to the murmured conversations of the other attendees, most of whom she didn't recognize. Some wore badges of local environmental groups, but their logos were the same ones printed on the banners in Joel's yard. The entire initiative had spread through the neighborhood like a new religion. Joel entered with his usual calm assurance, accompanied by a man in a suit who introduced himself as an environmental compliance consultant. The nameplate on his briefcase bore the same insignia she'd seen on the small sensor she had found near the oak. BLI Tech Division. Her stomach twisted with dread. He began the presentation, not with data this time, but with imagery. A looping video showing sunlight moving across landscapes, accompanied by a voiceover about the natural right of illumination. It was beautifully produced, almost cinematic, and for a moment Nora caught herself admiring the composition before realizing that this was precisely the point. Joel was using her own language, the aesthetic of light design, against her. The video ended with an image of a dark silhouette blocking a field of golden light, and a caption appeared, "Every obstruction is a wound in the balance of nature." The room remained silent for several seconds afterward, and in that silence she could feel her position eroding. When she was finally allowed to speak, she didn't appeal to sentiment. She spoke about soil preservation, about the importance of canopy trees in preventing groundwater evaporation, about how the oak supported multiple nesting species. She showed documentation from the county archives, proving that the tree predated all surrounding construction, including Joel's property. Her voice was steady, but the panelists exchanged hesitant glances, as though her logic were an inconvenience they couldn't afford to acknowledge. Then one of them, a man she hadn't seen before, interrupted to ask whether she was aware that her property had been flagged for potential zoning review under the new illumination corridor proposal. She froze for a moment, uncertain she'd heard correctly. "What proposal?" she asked. The man avoided her gaze, murmuring that it was still under discussion, a pilot project to evaluate neighborhood-wide light equity. After the session, as the room emptied, one of the junior aides from the county approached her quietly. She looked young, nervous, glancing around before speaking. "You should know," she said. "Someone's trying to shift the district boundary. It's subtle, but if they succeed, your lot will fall under a redevelopment zone. They're using environmental terms as cover." Nora stared at her, struggling to comprehend. The aide continued, voice low. "The BLI initiative's sponsoring it. They've been donating equipment to the department. Most people think it's harmless, but they're rewriting the maps." Before Nora could ask more, the girl slipped away, leaving her with the heavy realization that the oak was only the surface of something much larger. Over the following days, she began digging, literally and figuratively. She traced the small sensors hidden in the soil and along her fence line, finding half a dozen more, some freshly installed. She followed the serial numbers back through import records and discovered that they were listed as environmental illumination monitors, distributed as part of a county-sponsored pilot funded by the Braxton Light Initiative. The data they collected, about shadows, light diffusion, and even temperature, fed directly into the county's open access system, which Joel could legally access as a project contributor. He wasn't breaking the law, he was rewriting it from within. Each dataset, each manipulated report, reinforced his argument that her oak disrupted the light harmony of the community. The discovery filled her with both rage and a strange analytical calm. She spent nights cross-referencing public zoning maps, overlaying them with environmental boundaries. That was when she noticed something peculiar. Joel's house, though registered as residential, extended 30 feet beyond the official limit of the development zone. Those extra feet placed part of his foundation within a restricted wetland buffer area, land designated as protected after a flooding incident 20 years ago. If that was true, his entire structure stood on ground where construction was never legally permitted. The revelation hit her like a surge of electricity. She had spent months defending herself from fabricated accusations, while the man leading the crusade against her might be standing on an illegal foundation. The next morning, she drove to the county's environmental registry to confirm her findings. The clerk, an older man with the weary patience of someone used to bureaucratic absurdities, searched through the archives. When he found the document, his expression changed. "This area," he said, pointing at the map, was reclassified as a conservation buffer in 2006. No private development allowed within 50 feet of the marsh boundary. He paused, frowning. But someone filed a re-evaluation request a few years ago, sponsored by the Braxton Initiative. The case was marked pending, but there's no final approval. He tapped the screen. Technically, if construction proceeded during that period, it violates environmental code. Nora's pulse quickened. She asked for a printed copy, and as the machine hummed beside them, the clerk lowered his voice. "You didn't hear this from me, but that's not the first complaint about that property. There were drainage issues, reports of water diversion. It just disappeared from the system." As she left the office, a sharp sense of vindication mixed with dread. She had proof, but proof meant confrontation, and confrontation with someone like Joel was never simple. That night, she drafted a formal report to the Department of Natural Resources, attaching maps and registry excerpts, requesting an investigation into potential zoning violations. When she clicked Submit, her hands trembled, not from fear, but from the awareness that she had finally shifted from defense to offense. 2 days later, unmarked vehicles appeared near Joel's property. Men and women in plain clothes surveyed the land, took photographs, and marked coordinates with orange flags. Joel watched them from his porch, expression neutral but eyes calculating. For the first time, Nora saw him unsettled, his composure cracking at the edges. He approached one of the officials, gesturing animatedly, then retreated indoors. That evening, his panels went dark, the golden light extinguished for the first time in months. The street fell into a stillness so complete that Nora barely recognized it. For the first time, the night belonged to her again, but victory, she knew, was never that easy. A week later, a new notice arrived, an appeal filed by Joel's company against the Environmental Review, claiming that the wetland classification was outdated and that his foundation had been approved under special urban light zone exemptions. The language was dense, self-referential, and vaguely threatening. Yet beneath the technical jargon lay something desperate, as though Joel understood that the ground beneath his carefully curated world was finally shifting. Nora pinned the notice to her wall beside the earlier ones, each letter a fragment of a larger war. The oak, wounded but alive, stood outside her window, branches brushing softly against the glass, as if reminding her that some roots run deeper than paperwork. She didn't sleep that night. Instead, she watched the horizon beyond Joel's darkened house, waiting for the first trace of dawn, realizing that light itself, so pure, so simple in nature, had become the most corrupted thing in her world. The investigation should have slowed him down, but instead it seemed to ignite something in Joel, as if the scrutiny had only confirmed his self-importance. Within days of the county inspectors marking his property, his yard transformed into what looked like a campaign headquarters. New banners appeared, professionally printed, declaring, "Light belongs to everyone." A small group of followers, mostly visitors from his retreat, dressed in neutral tones, began appearing at dawn, meditating in synchronized lines along his fence. Their chants drifted across the street in rhythmic waves that made it impossible for Nora to ignore them even with her windows shut. They spoke of unity, cleansing, and exposure, words that had once sounded harmless but now carried a strange, coercive energy. Every morning they faced her oak, palms raised toward it like a congregation confronting a heretic idol. She began to feel as if the tree and she were both on trial for existing outside his vision of order. A week later, she found that someone had filed another complaint. This time, not against the tree, but against her personally. The document accused her of maintaining unauthorized obstruction to public illumination research. It was absurd, almost laughable, except that it came stamped with the seal of the county zoning board. The complaint alleged that she had interfered with community data collection and harassed licensed volunteers. She realized instantly what it meant. Joel had rebranded his private sensors as part of an official study, making her discovery of them look like sabotage. The notice carried the threat of a fine and a temporary injunction on altering environmental monitoring devices. It was a bureaucratic trap, elegant in its cruelty. When she called the county office to contest it, she was transferred from one department to another until a weary administrator finally admitted that the devices had been registered under a public-private partnership. "The paperwork's all in order," the man said apologetically. "If you tampered with them, it technically counts as interference." She tried to explain that they were placed on her private land without consent, but he only sighed and said, "I understand, but the lines get blurry with shared environmental projects." His tone was that of someone who had already surrendered to the system's absurdity. That evening, she returned home to find that someone had staked a new sign into the grass near her mailbox. "Shadow Density Measurement Zone. Do not disturb." The arrogance of it stunned her. She pulled the sign out and hurled it into the trash, but the next morning another one appeared, this time bolted to a metal post. It wasn't vandalism. It was escalation disguised as order. The neighbors watched from their driveways, pretending not to see. A few of them even nodded approvingly at Joel when he passed by, as if the whole spectacle were some civic improvement rather than harassment. She decided to take the matter directly to the Department of Natural Resources, the same agency now reviewing Joel's wetland violation. Her contact there, a pragmatic inspector named Renee Colliers, agreed to meet her off the record. They sat in a diner near the county courthouse, the kind of place where the lights buzzed faintly and the coffee was endlessly refilled. Renee listened in silence as Nora recounted everything. The sensors, the fabricated terminology, the public campaign. When Nora handed her the photos of the devices and the environmental data logs, Renee's eyes darkened. "These aren't just monitors," she said finally. "They're mapping water displacement too. That's wetland data. If he's rerouting it, even digitally, that's illegal." She promised to escalate it to the enforcement division. For the first time in months, Nora felt something like relief. Fragile, but real. Her relief didn't last. 2 days later, the local paper ran an article titled, "Controversy over Shading Practices Delays Wellness Project." It quoted Joel extensively, portraying him as a visionary entrepreneur facing resistance from outdated ecological bureaucracy. He spoke of a woman misusing environmental law to attack progress and obstructing light access vital for mental health. They didn't print her name, but they didn't need to. Everyone in the neighborhood knew exactly who he meant. Her inbox filled with anonymous messages, some mocking, others vaguely threatening. One simply read, "You can't own the sun." Renee called her that night, her voice tight. "He's mobilizing fast," she said. "He's filed a counterclaim saying the oak's root system is damaging the wetland and that cutting it down would restore natural water flow. It's a complete inversion of reality, but he's got data models. Fake, but convincing." She paused, then added, "We'll investigate, but be careful. He's not treating this as a zoning issue anymore. He's treating it as a movement." By the end of the week, trucks began arriving at Joel's property, unmarked, but hauling construction materials. She watched from behind her curtains as workers in reflective vests installed low, square devices around his foundation. The following day, the ground crews from the county appeared to inspect the same area, their vehicles emblazoned with environmental agency logos. The collaboration between Joel and official agencies had become seamless, his influence spreading through every procedural gap. That night, when the rain came, she noticed the water no longer pooling near her yard as it always had. It was flowing downhill, diverted subtly toward the storm drains by new channels of gravel along his property line. He wasn't just manipulating documents now, he was altering the landscape itself. When she confronted one of the workers the next morning, asking under what permit they were operating, he looked at her blankly and said, "We're improving runoff management. It's part of the Light Corridor project." She demanded to see the paperwork, but he only gestured vaguely toward Joel's porch, where the man himself stood watching, a glass of something amber in his hand, expression serene. "You should really stop fighting this," he called out. "It's all going to balance out soon." She walked back into her house, heart pounding, soaked in cold fury. The oak swayed in the rising wind, its leaves flashing silver-green in the afternoon light. She thought of how easily the county had absorbed his vocabulary, how his pseudoscience had turned into regulation, how words like illumination and balance had replaced meaning with obedience. That night she sent Renee a message with photos of the new drainage trenches and water redirection patterns. The reply came hours later, terse but urgent. "Do not touch anything. They're under investigation. The wetland line may already be breached." Outside, the rain continued for hours, a steady, relentless sound that blurred into the whisper of the oak's branches. When she looked out, she saw Joel's lights flicker once, then return brighter than before, reflecting off the pooling water that crept dangerously close to his foundation. For the first time, she didn't feel afraid of him. She felt something colder, a grim certainty that nature, indifferent to human vanity, was about to take back what had been stolen. The storm arrived 3 days before the final hearing, rolling in from the coast with a density that turned the sky into molten lead. By dusk, the air was heavy enough to taste, the wind pressing against the windows like a living thing. Nora sat at her desk surrounded by folders and photographs, trying to rehearse what she would say in the morning when the county gathered to decide the fate of her tree, and perhaps her home. Outside, the oak bent but did not break, its branches thrashing in slow, powerful arcs that looked almost deliberate. Joel's property glowed as always, though the reflections were fractured now, the water rising against his foundation, creating distorted ribbons of light that danced across the storm-soaked pavement. It struck her that his house looked less like a sanctuary and more like a ship going down with all its lights still on. When the rain intensified, she stepped onto the porch, drawn by the sound of rushing water. The drainage channels Joel had carved were overflowing, spilling through his yard and streaming toward the lower lots. The soil around his fence was eroding, the gravel washing away to reveal thin black pipes that ran deeper than any landscaping project should have required. Lightning flashed, illuminating the mess for an instant, and she saw it clearly, the illegal drainage system Renee had warned her about, funneling runoff from the wetland beneath his property straight into the public storm line. For months he had been diverting water to stabilize his illegal foundation, and now the storm was undoing everything. By midnight, the power went out across the street, plunging the neighborhood into an uneasy half-darkness. Only her house, powered by a backup generator she had installed years ago, remained lit. From across the rain-slicked street she could see Joel standing under his porch roof, phone in hand, shouting into it while the wind shredded his words. The serenity he had cultivated for so long was gone. He looked smaller, almost frantic, waving toward the flooding yard where the golden panels were cracking under pressure. When a piece of the mirrored terrace tore free and crashed into the current, he froze, watching it vanish into the black water. Nora felt no satisfaction, only a bleak, steady awareness that the situation was spiraling toward something irreversible. The next morning, the county building was crowded with officials, inspectors, and residents, all drawn by the spectacle of the dispute that had become local folklore. Joel arrived late, drenched and furious, carrying a soaked folder of documents. His face had lost its calm sheen. There were shadows under his eyes, and his normally pristine clothes looked disheveled. The chairwoman opened the session with a statement about public safety concerns following the night's flooding, noting that multiple properties along the light corridor had sustained damage. Joel interrupted almost immediately, insisting that the flooding had been caused by root obstruction from Nora's oak. His voice shook with anger, the smooth rhetoric replaced by raw desperation. He demanded that the tree be removed to restore natural flow, waving a photograph of his submerged yard as evidence. Nora stood when her turn came. She didn't look at him. Instead, she placed a single printed document on the table, the environmental report Renee's team had finalized that morning. The pages detailed the existence of unregistered drainage infrastructure beneath Joel's property, including diagrams showing illegal pipes crossing into the protected wetland zone. She spoke clearly, her tone calm, the kind of composure that cannot be faked. "This," she said, "is where the water came from. It wasn't the oak. It was what he buried beneath it." The room fell silent except for the hum of the fluorescent lights. The chairwoman scanned the document, then looked up sharply. "These installations were never approved. This violates multiple environmental codes." Joel began to protest, claiming fabrication, but his words dissolved as one of the inspectors entered with photographs taken that morning. Images of collapsed trenches, exposed pipes, and soil samples showing diverted flow. The hearing ended abruptly after that. The committee voted unanimously to suspend Joel's operations and forward the findings for a legal review. When it was over, he stormed out of the chamber without looking back. Outside, the storm clouds were breaking apart, thin shards of sunlight piercing through. Reporters had gathered on the steps, but Nora walked past them without speaking, her mind still filled with the image of his collapsing yard. As she reached her car, she saw county vehicles heading toward his property, their tires cutting through puddles that shimmered with the dull reflection of his fallen mirrors. That night, when she returned home, the street was quiet again. Joel's house was dark, its windows boarded and its yard cordoned off with tape. The oak stood unscathed, its leaves heavy with rain, its roots sunk deep into the earth that had finally rejected the intruder's design. Nora leaned against the porch railing, listening to the distant hum of insects returning after the storm. The light from her window spilled gently across the wet grass, and for the first time in months it felt natural. Not imposed, not stolen, simply part of the world's rhythm. Somewhere beyond the stillness, she thought she heard the faint groan of water draining through the marsh, a slow, patient sound that spoke of balance restored. In the weeks that followed, the neighborhood began to resemble itself again, stripped of the glare and artificial glow that had once defined it. The county crews dismantled the remnants of Joel's installations, hauling away cracked mirrors and corroded wiring, leaving behind raw patches of soil that would take seasons to heal. His property remained under investigation, the retreat permanently closed, its online presence erased overnight. Rumors drifted through the town. Some said he had moved back to the city, others that he had left the country entirely. But no one knew for sure. What remained was silence, thick and almost sacred after months of confrontation. Nora spent the first few days simply walking her yard, relearning its texture, the way the light filtered through the oak leaves in shifting patterns that no longer felt contested. The scars on the tree, remnants of the unauthorized trimming, had already begun to close, pale lines of new bark forming around the wounds. Nature, she thought, had no interest in revenge. It only knew persistence. Occasionally she met inspectors still cataloguing the damage, and they always paused at the sight of the oak, nodding as if it had become something more than a tree, an emblem of quiet defiance. The county eventually granted it protected status as part of a microhabitat restoration plan, the same program Joel had once tried to exploit. A small plaque was placed near its roots, Registered Heritage Oak, Environmental Preservation Zone. The words made her smile, not because of their bureaucratic neatness, but because they meant the struggle had left something tangible behind. Life returned to its ordinary rhythm, though ordinary had changed. The nights were darker now, unpolluted by artificial reflection, and she found herself working later, the soft rhythm of the wind through the branches replacing the hum of machinery that had once filled the street. Sometimes, when she stood under the tree, she would think of how fragile peace had seemed, and how easily someone's obsession could distort an entire system into believing that control was the same as harmony. The oak stood as proof of the opposite, that balance came only from endurance, from the refusal to bend entirely, even when bending seemed inevitable. As spring came, new leaves unfurled above her, pale and tender against the sunlight, and the world, finally, felt right again.